Hello, and Happy New Year, everyone. It's been a while since my last upload, and I hope you all are doing well. Thank you for clicking on this video. I'm sure you can already tell by the thumbnail and title that today's story is about Vinai. I want to start off by saying that I've tried my best to tell the story as accurately as possible. However, since I've never lived in Thailand or Vinai, I don't have a first-hand understanding of what these places are like. If you notice any minor inaccuracies, just know that it's because of me. Now let's get into the story. My maternal uncle, his wife, and kids were among the earlier waves of Hmong people that fled Laos and made it to America. In 1989, our great uncle, or we call him Yetzilong, he crossed over and made it to the Vinai refugee camp. From there, he was able to make connections with my uncle in America. That was how my uncle in America found out that my mom was still alive and living in Laos. He and Yetzilong then facilitated and hired people to sneak my mom and my 4-year-old self from Laos into Ban Vinai. In April of that year, we arrived on Thai soil. By this time, Ban Vinai had already been in operation for years, and they were no longer accepting new refugees into the camp. However, my mom and I were able to slip in with the help of those people that my uncle hired. As many of you may already know, the refugee camp was pretty big, spanning roughly 400 acres with thousands and thousands of refugees. Vinai was the start of a better beginning for many of us. It's a place that many, including myself, still look back on and cherish for the good memories created there. That said, there was also a dark side. Many people died in this camp due to lack of resources, proper care, or just natural causes. Towards the last few years before the camp officially closed, it became cold and creepy. It was Ban Vinai where I had my very first encounters with ghosts. When Ban Vinai camp opened in 1975, the UNHCR built rows of houses to accommodate the refugees. If you talk to someone that has lived in Vinai before, they would often refer to these houses as Jayakha. As the big number of refugees poured into the camp during that period, the demand for these homes quickly outpaced availability. So those unable to secure a spot in the pre-built houses had to make their own shelters from wood and bamboo in random spots throughout the camp. While my mom and I were still undocumented, we stayed with Yetzilong, his wife, and kids. The camp was divided into 9 zones. They lived in a makeshift home in Sonplau, or Zone 4 of the camp. Yetzilong and his wife had 5 kids. I hit it off right away with the ones that were close to my age. With these cousins of mine, we would go off into different zones of the camp without parental supervision, and we played all day until it got dark. Adjusting to life in Vinai came naturally to me, and those early days were filled with fun and adventures. Not long after settling into Vinai, I fell sick. As I was recovering, there was one particular morning when my mom and Netailong needed to go down to the nearby pond to wash clothes. Before going, my mom laid me down on the bed that was outside, attached to the side of the house.
Meto, kuto metoli, negukuta hogen kenke, nupudokunoma. Numitia, netamon sukundian jaju matolona. My mom and Netai's voices gradually faded as they made their way down the path to the pond. Weak and exhausted, I had no energy to do anything. I lied there and imagined all the fun my cousins were probably having while I was sick and stuck at home.
my gaze wandered through the sugarcane field that was located behind the house, only about 10 feet away from where I was laying. I watched as the small breezes passed through and the leaves of the sugarcane swayed gently. I kept staring at it until I got bored. I closed my eyes, and just as I was slipping into what would have been an early morning nap,
Yo, Chippy, no.
I opened my eyes immediately and looked to see who was calling my name. Amid the sugar canes, I spotted one stalk that looked different and wasn't moving like the rest. There was someone with a man's stature standing behind the stalk and holding the canes. The person slowly raised its hands. He pushed aside the sugar cane and bent forward, revealing his old, sunken face, creepily grinning at me. I threw myself off the bamboo bed and ran toward the pond where my mom was. Every time my mom and I sit down to retell this story, my mom would always describe how I showed up at the pond with my face drained of all colors and crying. That was my first encounter in Vinai, and it only continued after that. I guess you could say my third eye was awakened. About a month after, there was a unit of the nearby JAK that freed up. We were all supposed to move into the unit, but my mom and I moved in a few days before Yitzilongde joined us. The unit was among the strip of houses that were elevated, so you would have to climb up a little flight of stairs before you could get to the main living area. During those few days that we were alone at the JAK, there was one night where my mom and I were getting ready for bed before the 10 p.m. curfew. She went down the stairs to go grab the clothes that were still hanging outside to dry. I was laying down and mindlessly staring at the oil lamp that my mom set in the corner of the room. I was observing the flame as it danced around. Suddenly, it started to stretch and its edges darkened. It rapidly grew in size, and then there were strands that started unraveling like hair. It didn't take me long to realize that it was the back of someone's head. Slowly, the head tilted backward, revealing the face of a woman. Both her eyes and mouth were stretched wide open, looking like they were pulled to their absolute limit. The moment my eyes met her grotesque expression, she let out a chilling cry. It was something between a wail and a cat's meow, before lunging straight at me. Terrified, I shut my eyes and instinctively threw my arms up, screaming and crying in sheer panic.
Melia, watch out! Watch out, go! Wala tao, cha kutumi tu chindi lo.
Ôi chào. Con nè, đó anh em mình ngồi.
Đó chị bảo li à. Cô chẳng muốn giờ khấn giờ cho học ăn lời thì nó có được tớ cô kể lo cho. Nghĩ trong người nó xưa. Wow. Ở mấy tú mẹ chào ơi con.
Lâu, nên tôi bố mất con nào. Một kiện vài lời bé muốn dừng nó kia xe.
My body had went into shock and I became unresponsive. I wasn't totally gone. I could still faintly hear what was being said around me, but everything else was black and I couldn't fully feel my body. I could only tell that there were at least 4 pairs of hands massaging me at the same time, and I was only able to feel the pressure of the needle pricking me everywhere.
Mẹ tôi chân trong mơ. Nó nên nhảy xoay. Sao cứ chú trong đó. Mẹ tú li sợ lo.
Mẹ chỉ xí sao cho nó chạy cái tơ bé con mà. Một chỗ cũng là bên này cũng có bên nơi ta hoa thế sao đâu. Đó chỉ tập bỏ tết tụi mình ngủ ở mỗi nào thế nào.
Nè bữa tao mót tới giờ cho nó nói chờ nó mua chỉ hồng nữa nè.
Nhưng chỉ tôi muốn đi họ thử ta chè nhưng nó tí không ngó thì nên chú nói đâu xin à.
I don't know if the massages and needle pricking was what saved me, but I felt my body spring back to life. I was jerked back into motion as I let out the rest of my cry. This experience scared my mom. I'm sure she had her suspicions about me being able to see things others couldn't. She bought me a chicken to play with the next day so that I would stay home with her while she does pandao. She became more strict and wouldn't let me out of her sight. I was no longer allowed to go far with my cousins anymore. But it was Vinai. My mom couldn't stop me from having fun. I snuck out so many times, and each time I get caught, I would get yelled at. But it was all worth it. There was one morning where my mom dressed me in a new outfit that she just bought from the Thai vendor. While she was talking with the neighboring ladies, I snuck out with my 3 cousins.
Cũng mới lưu trì gì? Là bé mù thì soạn cho bé mù đã đi tỏ băm bờ ạ.
There were 2 very big problems with this idea already. First, Suntyo was the burial site for all the dead. During the day, it might seem lively, but as the sun sets and everyone rushes home to make the curfew, the atmosphere shifts, becoming eerily quiet and creepy. Secondly, Bambo, the pond we were heading to. It got its name because someone named Mbo had drowned there. Over the years, that pond had claimed many lives, especially those of children. I didn't know any better though, so I went along and followed them to Suntyo. Arriving there, we took off all our clothes, placed them on the shore, and then we hopped in. There were at least a dozen other kids swimming there with the 4 of us. At the shallow end of the pond, the 4 of us, along with this random kid, had a breath-holding contest to see who could last the longest. My oldest cousin, Jinu, said,
Đêm lòng à, cô xóa y, bé, nó chế bé plot ta hộp kia nông cho hồn à. Y, bé.
We all plunged into the water. I stayed underwater for what felt like a pretty long time. When my lungs gave out, I popped up from the water. It was hard to tell, but I scanned the murky water and waited for the rest of my cousins to surface. I turned around and discovered that all of them had already surfaced and they were already moving further out. Their heads were bopping as they all waded deeper into the pond. I rushed forward to try and catch up to them. The water level was at my waist, but as I kept following them, the water climbed to my chest and then my shoulders. Before I knew it, the water was up to my chin. I had to tippy-toe just to keep my head above the water. My cousins kept bobbing their heads, going deeper into the pond. They didn't stop. They didn't even turn around. The water was getting too deep, and I finally realized how far I had come. I didn't want to follow them anymore. I stopped to turn around to go back towards the shallow end. Turning around, I saw my 3 cousins still back at the shallow part, in the exact place that we were doing the breath-holding contest. That's when panic set in for me. I thrashed my legs frantically so I could get back to safety. But no matter how hard I was kicking, I was not moving. Suddenly, on my right ankle, I felt a cold hand latch onto it. My feet started lifting off the ground. I could feel myself drifting backwards. From the corner of my eye, I saw someone standing a little to the right of me. It was a girl, older and taller than me. I knew if I wanted to reach her, I had to try harder, so I kicked with all my might. Without much thinking, I extended my arm and grabbed onto her long ponytail, jolting her head backwards. She turned around and realized I was drowning, so she helped pull me towards her. When she did that, I could feel the release of the cold hand that was on my ankle. I'm forever grateful to the girl who saved me that day. Had she not been there, things could have turned out very differently. I was so shaken by what happened that day that I didn't even care about the embarrassment of walking all the way back home from Suntyo completely naked. My new clothes that I left on the shore got stolen by some kid. When my mom found out that we had gone to Bambo and got my clothes stolen as well, she was furious, rightfully so. I felt super guilty. I didn't tell her the full story of what happened that day. To really soften the blow, I actually didn't tell her until years later after we had already come to the US. After what I guess you could call a near-death experience, things settled down for a while. It wasn't until almost a year into our time in Vinai that something happened. I'll never forget about that night. It was one late afternoon where my cousins and I decided to head out and catch crickets. We walked around the little patches of garden, searching for the creatures in the fading light. For some reason, night felt unusually fast. The sky dimmed in what felt like an instant. We hadn't even been out catching crickets for long, but we all quickly decided to make our way back home before it got too dark. On our way home, we strolled down an empty road, chatting and giggling. I made a sudden stop. A big cricket sat on the side of the road, and I couldn't resist trying to catch it. While my cousins continued ahead, I crouched down and reached out slowly. I had my hands in form and I cupped it. The cricket leapt away, disappearing into the messy, tall grass. By the time I gave up and stood back up, they were already further down the path. One of my cousins was waiting up ahead while the rest were already far away. The ones that were further away, I could barely see their silhouettes anymore. I jogged up to catch up with the cousin that was waiting for me. As I got closer, I noticed it was not my cousin at all. It was a female figure standing in the middle of the path. I cautiously picked up my pace, but I stopped. I recognized her. It was Nitiku, the pretty daughter-in-law of our neighbors. With relief, I asked,
Nati, come watch.
Without saying a word, she raised her finger and pointed down the road in the direction that we came from. I continued jogging home at my own pace. By then, I had given up hope of catching up with my cousins, but I wasn't too worried. I knew Nitiku was behind me now. When I finally reached home, I noticed a large crowd gathered at our neighbor's house. The commotion drew me in, and I inched closer, curious to see what was going on. My mom, who was already there, spotted me. She grabbed my arms and yanked me back, scolding me for wandering into the chaos.
Chị tâu là chè cho một tô tỏ chị chuê xế là kiểu bộ tâu là solo. Nê kiểu lối gió mà nê môn gió chè nê xí băng cả.
Moments later, I watched as a few men carried someone out of the house. They moved quickly, but not before I caught a glimpse. It was Nitiku. The same Nitiku I had passed on the road while coming home. My young mind didn't understand at the time. I just thought it was strange that she made it home before me. As Nitiku was being taken to the hospital, people were still chattering outside of the house. They talked about how she was struck with intense stomach pain out of nowhere. She defecated and urinated uncontrollably before collapsing to the ground. No one really knew what happened to her. That night, as we lay in bed, loud cries and wails echoed from the neighbors. In Vinai, we'd heard mourning like that plenty of times before, so even I understood what it meant. Nitiku didn't make it. The strangest part came a day later, at her funeral. During the whole time I was in Vinai, I had only seen Nitiku in simple button-up shirts and floral skirts. However, when they laid her body out at her funeral, I realized she was dressed exactly the same way I had seen her that night. I remember that night. How odd it was to see her in Hmong clothes. Not long after everything happened, we were transferred to Sonapol. Life went on, but the types of things I saw in Vinai didn't end. I continued to see and get glimpses of things that others don't see. My sensitivity has mellowed out over time, but I am still more sensitive to these things than most people. It's just something I've learned to live with.